I never expected to feel my entire body freeze in the middle of a wedding reception, but there I was, rooted to the spot, staring at the enormous screen as my entire existence was reduced to an insult. The laughter that erupted around me was loud, grating, and unbearably cruel, echoing through the lavishly decorated ballroom where my younger sister, Madison, celebrated the happiest day of her life. She stood at the center of it all, grinning at my humiliation as my failures were projected for everyone to see. My struggles turned into nothing more than a punchline for an audience that seemed all too eager to laugh at my expense. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening as my stomach churned, but I refused to let them see me falter. Years of pain, years of being the disappointment, years of being treated like the family embarrassment. It all culminated in this moment, where they didn't just ignore me, but actively chose to humiliate me. Infertile, divorced failure, high school dropout, low income, single. The words flickered in bold, glowing letters across the massive screen, a grotesque parody of a tribute reel. Guests chuckled and whispered behind their champagne glasses, reveling in the joke, as if my pain was some comedic skit for their entertainment. My sister, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, leaned toward her new husband and smirked, her perfectly styled blonde curls bouncing as she laughed. "Don't laugh too much," she cooed, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "She might cry." I heard my mother sip her wine, the delicate clink of her glass against her manicured nails serving as her only response. My father chuckled from his seat near the head of the table, nodding approvingly as if this public degradation was just harmless family fun. "Just a joke, right?" my father said, his voice filled with amusement, his eyes never even glancing my way, as if I wasn't standing right there, absorbing the weight of their cruelty. I exhaled slowly, forcing my expression to remain calm, steady, unreadable. My fingers trembled slightly, but I clenched them into a fist at my side, willing myself to stay composed. They expected me to be embarrassed, to lower my head, to slink away like I always had when they pushed me down. They wanted me to sit there, humiliated, and let their laughter pierce through me like 1,000 invisible knives. But they had forgotten something crucial. I had learned how to survive. I had spent years picking myself up after each disaster, after every disappointment, after every moment where life decided to crush me just a little bit more. My ex-husband had left me shattered, my body had betrayed me with its inability to carry a child, my own choices had led me down a path of struggle, but none of that had broken me. And I would be damned if I let these people, my own flesh and blood, reduce me to a joke at my sister's wedding. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I held it with purpose, letting my manicured nails tap lightly against the glass as I scrolled through my saved files. The anticipation was thick, the air shifting around me as the laughter continued, oblivious to the storm I was about to unleash. My voice was quiet, but it carried. The room fell silent. Eyes turned toward me, confusion flickering in their expressions as they watched, waiting, uncertain of what was happening. My father's smirk faltered slightly, my mother set her wine glass down, and Madison raised a perfectly sculpted brow in intrigue. Then, the screen changed. Gone were the cruel words that had been used to define me, erased in an instant and replaced with something else entirely. I had been patient for far too long. I had swallowed my pain, endured their mistreatment, and allowed them to push me aside, but this moment, this was my turn. If they wanted a show, I would give them one. Because I had receipts. And I was about to burn their perfect little world to the ground. A moment stretched between us, heavy with the weight of uncertainty, thick with the anticipation of something no one in this room could quite grasp yet. The screen that had been my humiliation now flickered, the cruel words vanishing into nothingness as my fingers danced across my phone screen, commanding the change. The laughter that had filled the air only seconds ago had been swallowed whole by something far more satisfying: silence. It wasn't just any silence. It was the kind that prickled against the skin, that made people shift in their seats, that sent a ripple of unease through a once celebratory room. The kind of silence that happened when people realized they might have gone too far, when their confidence wavered, when they sensed that maybe, just maybe, they had pushed the wrong person. I lifted my chin slightly, taking in the faces before me, letting the tension simmer, letting them all feel the weight of the moment. My father had stopped chuckling, his hands still resting near the rim of his whiskey glass, his eyes narrowing as he tried to assess what was happening. My mother, ever the queen of polished indifference, had set her wine down with measured grace, her lips pressing together just slightly, the only indication that she was now watching me with caution. My beautiful, perfect, golden child sister, draped in her designer wedding gown, basking in the afterglow of a celebration that had been curated with the sole purpose of solidifying her image as the favorite, the most accomplished, the untouchable. She had orchestrated this, had reveled in the spectacle of my public humiliation, had ensured that my failures were displayed for all to see so she could shine brighter in comparison. But she didn't look so victorious anymore. She was still smiling, but it was no longer the smug, effortless grin of someone who thought she had won. It was tighter now, more forced, her hands gripping her new husband's arm just a little too hard, her fingers digging into the fabric of his tuxedo sleeve. She had been the one to orchestrate my downfall tonight, but what she had failed to realize was that I had come prepared. The screen flickered again, and this time, the images that appeared were ones only I had the power to reveal. "Let's start with a toast to the happy couple," I said, my voice steady, even, a slow smile curling at the edges of my lips. After all, what's a wedding without a few surprises? The first image filled the screen, and just like that, the carefully constructed world my sister had built began to splinter. It was a screenshot. A text message conversation, dated 6 months ago, between Madison and a name that was most certainly not her new husband's. The words were clear, undeniable, immortalized in sharp black text against the glowing white screen. "Madison, I miss you. I hate sneaking around, but he's so clueless it's almost funny. Unknown number. It won't be for much longer, right? You're still leaving him after the wedding like we planned? Madison, of course. He's just a means to an end. I just need his last name and his money first." The sound that came from Madison's throat was something between a gasp and a strangled protest, her manicured fingers reaching up as if she could somehow will the screen to shut off through sheer desperation alone. But I wasn't finished. The murmur started then, hushed and sharp, slicing through the room as the weight of the revelation settled over the guests like a heavy fog. The groom, still gripping his champagne flute, was frozen in place, his once adoring gaze now filled with confusion, horror, the slow unraveling of a man who had just realized his entire life was a lie. I tilted my head slightly, watching the cracks in my sister's composure spread like spiderwebs across the polished surface of her perfect life. "That's just the beginning," I continued, swiping my finger across the screen once more, revealing yet another piece of her carefully hidden truth. Because it turns out, when you make someone the punchline of your joke, you forget that they might have receipts of their own. Another image appeared this time, a bank transaction. Large, substantial, transferred in small increments over the course of the past year, all from Madison's personal account to one that belonged to a man named Eric Patterson. A name that was also conveniently attached to a series of hotel reservations in different cities, each one booked under Madison's maiden name, each one paid for using a joint credit card that had, until today, belonged to her now husband. The collective gasp that filled the room was intoxicating. I could feel the power shifting, the balance tilting in my favor, the sharp sting of my earlier humiliation now nothing more than a distant memory. They had tried to reduce me to nothing, but they had underestimated just how much I had learned about survival, about patience, about waiting for the right moment to strike. My father had gone rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle in his cheek twitched, his grip on his glass tightening with barely restrained fury. My mother, ever the master of composure, had paled slightly, her fingers pressing against her temples as if the weight of this realization was giving her a migraine. Madison, however, was unraveling before our eyes. You bitch," she shrieked, the shrillness of her voice cracking through the room like lightning. "You think this makes you better than me? You think this makes you less of a failure? I smiled then, slow and deliberate, stepping forward just slightly so that every person in that room knew exactly where I stood. "No, Madison," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. "It just means I refuse to be your victim anymore." The groom, still silent, still staring at the evidence of his wife's betrayal in stunned disbelief, finally moved. He set his champagne flute down with careful precision, his jaw tightening, his entire body radiating barely restrained rage as he turned toward his new wife. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous, filled with something that sent a visible shudder through Madison's trembling frame. And just like that, the wedding reception that had been meant to celebrate my sister's perfect life had transformed into the beginning of her downfall. And I had only just begun. The silence that followed my sister's outburst was the kind that didn't just fill a room, it consumed it whole, swallowing every breath and every thought as if the walls themselves had collapsed under the weight of the truth. The screen behind me still flickered, casting the damning words in harsh, inescapable clarity, each message an undeniable testament to Madison's betrayal. The carefully crafted illusion she had built over the past year of love, of devotion, of perfection was now nothing more than ash beneath her trembling hands. Madison turned, her wide, panicked eyes locking onto her new husband's face, searching desperately for something, perhaps mercy, perhaps denial, perhaps even an excuse that could save her from the wreckage she had created. But she found none of those things. Daniel, the man she had so gleefully planned to discard, stood stiffly beside her, his fingers flexing and unflexing at his sides, his jaw set so tightly that I wondered if it might snap beneath the pressure of his rage. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was deafening, a sharp contrast to the murmurs now swirling through the room as guests leaned toward one another, whispering in hushed, scandalized tones. "Is it true?" His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, too quiet, laced with something far more dangerous than anger. It was the voice of a man who had just realized his entire life was a lie and was still deciding whether he would burn everything down with it. Madison opened her mouth, a frantic, stammering sound escaping before she managed to find actual words, her hands reaching for Daniel's arm as though the simple act of touching him could erase the truth from existence. "Baby, it's not what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling, her carefully curated poise slipping away with every second that passed. "I was going to tell you after the honeymoon, After the honeymoon?" Daniel repeated, his laugh short and humorless, an empty, hollow sound that sent another ripple of unease through the guests. "You mean after you drained my accounts and ran off with your boyfriend?" I watched as Madison flinched, her perfectly manicured hands tightening into fists at her sides, her breathing uneven, erratic, as she struggled to regain control of the narrative. But there was no salvaging this. "Not this time. This isn't fair," she snapped, turning toward me now, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're just bitter because I have everything and you have nothing. You couldn't stand that I got married first, so you had to ruin it." I tilted my head, my lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from it either. I had expected her to lash out, to deflect, to twist the blame back onto me as she always did, but this time, there was no audience willing to applaud her performance. I gestured toward the screen behind me, where her own words still lingered like ghosts, haunting and unrelenting. "I didn't ruin anything, Madison," I said, my voice calm, measured, deliberate. "You did that all on your own." Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to physically rid himself of the last 24 hours, of the vows he had spoken, of the love he had thought was real. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo, pulling out his phone, his fingers tapping against the screen with a finality that made Madison's entire body stiffen. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice small now, fragile, as if she already knew the answer and just didn't want to hear it. "Canceling the honeymoon reservations," Daniel replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "And freezing the joint account before you have a chance to touch a single cent of my money." Madison's gasp was sharp, almost wounded, her perfectly painted lips parting in disbelief as her fairy tale world continued to crumble around her. "Daniel, please," she whispered, taking a step closer, reaching for him again, her voice shaking with something that almost sounded like desperation. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand just fine," he cut in, his words sharp enough to slice through the last of her defenses. "I understand that I married a woman who never loved me, who planned to use me, and who thought I was stupid enough to never find out." His voice grew colder, quieter, almost pitying. "The only thing I don't understand," he continued, looking her up and down as if seeing her for the very first time, "is how I ever thought you were worth loving." The sound of Madison's breath hitching was nearly lost beneath the growing murmurs of the guests, their whispers swelling into a storm of hushed disbelief, their eyes darting between her and Daniel as if watching a slow-motion disaster unfold before them. My father, still seated at the head table, had gone rigid, his hand tightening around his glass, his knuckles white. For the first time that evening, he looked at me, not with amusement, not with condescension, but with something closer to fear. He understood now. He understood that if I had been willing to do this to Madison, if I had been willing to destroy her so effortlessly, then I was just as capable of turning my attention to the rest of them. And I would. Because my sister may have been the one to orchestrate my humiliation tonight, but my family had spent years making sure I never forgot that I was the failure, the disappointment, the burden. They had stripped me of dignity, of respect, of love. But I had taken something far more valuable from them. Their power. Madison turned back toward me then, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her breathing shallow, her entire body trembling with the force of her rage. "You think this makes you better than me?" She spat, her voice raw, cracked, barely held together. "You think you've won?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted her to sit with it, to feel the weight of her own destruction pressing against her ribs, to let the realization sink in that there was no coming back from this. Then, finally, I took a step closer, leaned in just enough that only she could hear the words that followed. "I don't think I've won, Madison," I whispered, my lips barely moving. "I know I have." And with that, I turned, stepping off the stage, leaving her standing there alone, exposed, broken. The moment I stepped off that stage, the weight of the evening finally settled over the room like an unshakable fog, thick with tension and unspoken realizations. The hushed murmurs of the guests had shifted into frantic whispers, each conversation layered with speculation, each glance darting between Madison's crumbling composure and Daniel's unflinching stare. The bride, my sister, the one who had stood at the pinnacle of perfection for years, had finally fallen from grace, and the sound of her descent was deafening. I didn't turn back to look at her, though I could feel her burning gaze searing into my back, could hear the uneven hitch in her breath as she struggled to grasp onto the last shreds of her carefully curated world. She was unraveling, and for the first time in my life, I had no intention of catching her before she hit the ground. But this wasn't just about Madison anymore. She had been the instigator, the one who had put my humiliation on display tonight, but she wasn't the only one who had spent years ensuring I knew my place in this family. No, the rest of them had stood by, watching, encouraging, complicit in every cruel word and condescending remark, too comfortable in their superiority to ever consider the possibility that I might one day push back. And I was just getting started. As I reached the edge of the ballroom, my father's voice cut through the chaos, deep and commanding, the way it had always been when he wanted control. "That's enough." The room quieted, as if instinctually conditioned to yield to his authority. Even the guests, many of whom barely knew our family beyond surface-level pleasantries, turned their attention toward him, waiting for the patriarch to restore order, to remind everyone that the balance of power still rested in his hands. But he wasn't addressing the room. He was addressing me. Slowly, deliberately, I turned to face him, meeting his gaze head-on, unwilling to shrink beneath the weight of his scrutiny as I had so many times before. His expression was unreadable, but I had spent my entire life deciphering his particular brand of disapproval. The clenched jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the carefully measured inhale before speaking, it was the look he reserved for when things had slipped out of his control, when something or someone had disrupted the illusion of our perfect family. "You've made your point," he said, his voice even, steady, but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. There's no need to drag this any further. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it, the sound foreign even to my own ears. No need? I echoed, shaking my head in disbelief. You let them put my entire life on display for their amusement, and now you want to decide when enough is enough? My mother, still seated beside him, reached for her wine glass once more, taking a slow sip as if this entire scene was nothing more than an inconvenience, an unpleasant disruption to an otherwise lovely evening. Her fingers, adorned with rings that gleamed under the chandelier's glow, tapped idly against the stem of her glass, her expression carefully composed, betraying nothing. It was always my father who spoke, who dictated, who commanded. But my mother? She was the one who orchestrated, who maneuvered, who ensured that every piece of the puzzle fit exactly as she wanted it to. And she wasn't speaking now because she was waiting to see if I would yield, if I would fall back in line, if I would recognize the unspoken warning in my father's words. I smiled then, slow and deliberate, feeling the weight of my phone still in my grip, the evidence I had yet to reveal resting just beneath my fingertips. I was going to stop with Madison, I said, keeping my voice light, almost conversational. But then I remembered, she learned this from somewhere. The shift in the room was immediate. I watched as my mother's fingers stilled against her glass, as my father's jaw tightened just slightly, as Madison, still standing near the stage, her mascara smudged, her wedding gown now nothing more than a costume for a role she had lost, let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, this should be good," she muttered, swiping angrily at the corner of her eye, her voice thick with resentment. "Go on, then. Let's hear it." I took my time, scrolling through the carefully organized files on my phone, selecting the one I had debated using for months. I had told myself, over and over again, that it wasn't worth it, that exposing them wouldn't change anything, that it would only give them more reason to cast me as the bitter, ungrateful disappointment. But standing here now, with every set of eyes fixed on me, waiting, anticipating, dreading, I knew there was no going back. With one final tap, the screen flickered again. And this time, it was my parents' secrets that filled the room. Not just any bank statements, but transfers, large, repeated, carefully hidden transfers from accounts that my father had always insisted didn't exist, accounts that my mother had claimed were strictly for investments. The amounts were staggering, siphoned into private holdings under names that didn't belong to them, tucked away beneath layers of deception, the kind of deception that could shatter more than just reputations. Gasps rippled through the room as numbers filled the screen, as the reality of what they were looking at began to settle, as my father slowly, carefully, set his glass down with the precision of a man who knew he was about to lose everything. "You always said I was the family embarrassment," I murmured, watching as my mother's carefully curated mask began to crack, as my father's knuckles turned white against the tablecloth. "But it looks like I'm not the only one with failures to hide." The guests, once spectators to my humiliation, were now witnesses to something far greater, something far more damning. Because this wasn't just about a petty sibling rivalry anymore. This was about fraud, about deception, about the truth they had spent years burying, now laid bare for everyone to see. And just like that, the family they had spent a lifetime pretending to be ceased to exist. The ballroom had never been this quiet, not even at the start of the evening when anticipation had hung in the air like a thick perfume. But now, there was no excitement, no whispered compliments about the decor, no polite laughter at rehearsed speeches. The weight of the truth had sucked the oxygen from the room, leaving only a deafening silence that settled over the tables like a heavy shroud. My father hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't even blinked since the screen revealed the bank statements, his secrets laid bare in the most public way imaginable. My mother, the picture of unshakable composure for as long as I could remember, had finally faltered. Her fingers trembled slightly against the delicate stem of her wine glass, her manicured nails clicking softly as she fought to maintain her grip, not just on the glass, but on the last remnants of control. A single, sharp exhale cut through the silence, and I turned to see Madison, my sister, still standing in the same spot where her world had fallen apart only moments ago. Her wedding gown, once pristine and elegant, now seemed to weigh her down, the intricate lace and delicate beading unable to hide the sheer devastation on her face. "This isn't real," she whispered, shaking her head as if trying to physically reject the reality unfolding before her. "This is a mistake." I almost laughed at the irony of it. Only minutes ago, she had been the one smirking, reveling in my pain, orchestrating my public humiliation for the amusement of her guests. But now? Now she wanted to rewrite the story, to pretend this wasn't happening, to undo the damage with sheer denial. I took a slow step forward, letting my heels click deliberately against the polished floor, making sure every movement carried intention, making sure they all felt it. "No, Madison," I said, keeping my voice steady, controlled, laced with the kind of finality that couldn't be argued against. "It's very real." The screen behind me remained unchanged, the damning evidence displayed in neat, undeniable figures, hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into hidden accounts, transferred in sums just small enough to avoid raising suspicion, spread across names that didn't belong to my parents but led directly back to them. I turned my gaze toward my father, watching as he exhaled slowly, the subtle shift in his expression the only indication that he was finally processing what had just happened. He had spent years holding power over this family, dictating the narrative, deciding which truths were acceptable and which needed to be buried. But he wasn't the one in control anymore. "How long did you think you could keep it hidden?" I asked, tilting my head slightly, studying the way his fingers curled tightly against the tablecloth, his entire body coiled with barely restrained tension. "How many times did you lie to us?" To everyone in this room, a ripple of unease moved through the guests, a shifting of weight in seats, a tightening of shoulders, a few hands reaching for abandoned glasses of champagne, as if alcohol might somehow soften the harsh reality before them. Finally, my father spoke. "You don't know what you're talking about." His voice was calm, measured, the tone of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of control, of speaking with authority so people never questioned him. But I wasn't just anyone. I was his daughter, the daughter he had underestimated, dismissed, belittled, and cast aside for years. And now he was trapped. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I countered, keeping my voice unwavering, unwilling to let him regain even a fraction of the dominance he had once held over me. "You and Mom have been laundering money for years. You used fake names, shell companies, and just enough misdirection to keep it quiet, but not quiet enough." My mother inhaled sharply, the sound barely audible but impossible to miss in the stillness of the room. It was the first real emotion she had shown all night, the first time I had ever seen a crack in her perfect exterior. "How long?" The voice didn't belong to me. It came from across the room, from the table where my mother's oldest friend, Evelyn Sinclair, sat with her husband, a man whose family had been business partners with my father for decades. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers had tightened around the napkin in her lap, her entire body rigid with the weight of what she was now understanding. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked again, this time directing the question at my mother, her voice carrying an edge that wasn't just suspicion, it was betrayal. My mother, for the first time in her life, looked truly lost. She parted her lips as if to respond, but no words came, no carefully curated lie to smooth over the cracks, no strategic deflection to shift the attention elsewhere. Because there was nothing left to manipulate. They had been exposed. "Do you think they'll just let this go?" I asked, watching my father now, watching the way his mind worked rapidly behind his cold, calculating eyes. "Do you think everyone in this room will just forget what they saw?" I let my words settle, let them sink in, let him feel the weight of what I had just taken from him. His reputation, his power, his control, gone in a matter of minutes. He exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, before finally speaking. "You think this is a victory?" he asked, his voice quieter now, his expression unreadable. "You think ruining your own family in front of an audience makes you strong?" I didn't flinch, didn't waver, Didn't let the weight of his words seep into my skin the way they used to. "No," I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "What makes me strong is the fact that, for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of you anymore." A shift moved through him, something I couldn't quite place, perhaps realization, perhaps something darker. But before he could respond, before my mother could even attempt to salvage the wreckage, the sound of footsteps echoed through the ballroom, firm and authoritative. I turned just as the doors swung open, revealing 2 uniformed officers stepping inside, their gazes sweeping the room with calculated precision. And then, the lead officer spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, we need you to come with us." The gasps that followed were deafening. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just stood there, watching as the life my parents had built came crashing down around them. And for the first time, I felt free. The moment the officers stepped into the ballroom, the already fractured evening shattered completely. The murmurs that had filled the space only moments ago turned into sharp, panicked whispers, a collective breathlessness settling over the room as every guest processed what was happening. My mother's carefully maintained mask of composure crumbled in an instant, her usual air of indifference giving way to something raw, something dangerously close to fear. She had always prided herself on never showing weakness, on keeping control even when the world around her spiraled. But there was no escaping this, no smooth deflection or carefully crafted excuse that could undo the sight of 2 uniformed officers approaching with quiet authority, their expressions unreadable, their presence undeniable. My father, on the other hand, didn't move, not at first, at least. He remained seated at the table, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed forward as if refusing to acknowledge the officers standing beside him. It was the same stubborn arrogance he had wielded my entire life, the same unshakable belief that he was untouchable, that he could talk his way out of anything. But even he had to know, somewhere deep inside, that this was different. This time, there would be no talking his way out. The lead officer, a man in his early 40s with a sharp gaze and a quiet but commanding presence, cleared his throat before speaking. "Robert and Evelyn Caldwell, you are under investigation for financial fraud, money laundering, and multiple counts of embezzlement," he said, his voice even, practiced, carrying through the ballroom with a weight that left no room for argument. "We have a warrant to take you in for questioning." A gasp rippled through the guests, their horror a tangible force that spread like wildfire, igniting disbelief, igniting panic, igniting the sudden realization that the couple they had admired, envied, and socialized with for decades were nothing more than criminals who had finally been caught. My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor, the delicate sound somehow deafening in the silence that followed. "This is absurd," she breathed, shaking her head, her hands trembling as she reached for my father's arm. "Robert, say something." But for the first time in my life, my father had no words. He clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between the officers and the guests who now watched him with something that wasn't just shock, it was betrayal. These were the people who had trusted him, who had believed in him, who had done business with him. And now, they were realizing that they had been played for fools. He exhaled sharply before finally pushing his chair back, standing slowly, carefully, as if moving too quickly might somehow make this nightmare real. "I assume my lawyer has already been contacted," he said, his voice strained but controlled, a man still clinging to the last threads of his authority. The officer didn't flinch. "That will be arranged at the station." My mother let out a sharp breath, her nails digging into my father's arm, her entire body rigid as she turned to the officer with a smile that was meant to be charming, persuasive. "This is all just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice taking on the polished, rehearsed tone she had always used at dinner parties when she wanted people to see her as refined, elegant, untouchable. "My husband and I are well-respected members of this community. Surely we can." "Ma'am, we are not here for negotiations," the officer interrupted, his patience thin, his tone firm. "We need you to come with us now." That was when she finally broke. "You ungrateful little bitch." The words erupted from her lips before she could stop them, her composure snapping like a brittle thread as she turned toward me, her carefully curated image now nothing more than shards at her feet. Her face twisted in fury, her manicured hands clenching at her sides, her body vibrating with an anger that was no longer masked by civility. "You did this," she seethed, her voice trembling, her entire body shaking with the force of her rage. "After everything we've done for you, after everything we've given you, this is how you repay us?" I tilted my head slightly, studying her as if seeing her for the very first time, as if finally understanding the depth of her delusion. "Everything you've done for me?" I repeated, my voice eerily calm, my heart steady in a way I hadn't expected. "You humiliated me tonight. You've humiliated me my entire life." She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "You built a house of lies and then blamed me when it collapsed," I continued, stepping closer, my voice unwavering, unshaken. "You spent years making sure I felt small, making sure I knew I would never be enough. But you know what?" I smiled then, slow and deliberate, letting her feel the weight of every moment that had led to this one. "I was always more than enough. You were just too afraid to admit it." The officers stepped forward then, one placing a firm but polite hand on my mother's arm, the other nodding toward my father, giving him one final moment before escorting them out. My mother's protests were nothing more than echoes now, her voice rising, breaking, shattering as she thrashed against the inevitable. My father, ever the stoic one, simply inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and walked toward the exit without looking back. And just like that, they were gone. The silence that followed wasn't the same suffocating kind from earlier. It wasn't the sharp, painful kind that came from shame. This was different. This was relief. I turned then, scanning the room, watching as the guests processed everything they had just witnessed. Some stared down at their plates, their appetites long gone. Others shifted uncomfortably, already reaching for their phones, no doubt composing texts to spread the news beyond these walls. And then there was Madison. She was still standing near the stage, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the fabric of her wedding dress as if grounding herself against the reality she couldn't escape. She swallowed hard, taking a single, tentative step toward me. "Claire." I held up a hand, stopping her before she could begin whatever plea, whatever excuse, whatever desperate grasp at sympathy she was about to attempt. "Don't," I said, my voice final, my patience long gone. "You made your bed, Madison. Now lie in it." Her lips parted slightly, her expression twisting with something unreadable, anger, regret, desperation. But I didn't stay to figure out which. I turned away, stepping through the stunned crowd, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom,